Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. When I was a kid, the first single-engine World War II fighter I ever built was the Airfix 1/72nd scale 190 F-8 kit from 2013. And I was always a little bit sad that I didn't do the winter scheme, although it probably was a little bit beyond my skills at the time. So a few years later now, I'll be doing this aircraft using some spare parts, leftover decals, and this Airfix 190 A-8. So without further ado, let's have a build of this kit. I start off by giving all the sprues a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue from the parts which might prevent paint and glue from sticking to them, and then I begin cutting out the first few parts I need, which include the cockpit tub, pilot figure, instrument panel, fuselage halves, the exhausts, the engine, wings, and the cannons from the sprues. Once removed, I then cut off any excess sprue and sand away any seam lines or imperfections. The original Airfix F-8 kit came with 4 bombs for the underside of the wings, and although I could find the original 250kg bomb, I couldn't find any of the smaller ones, so I found a couple spare and used a needle to drill out the kit's attachment points and test fitted the bombs. The F-8s had their outer cannons removed, so before installing the outer wing panels, I cut away and sanded off the ejector port and then glued them into place. The final modification to the underside of the wings was to drill out the holes for the centre rack, which I'll put the kit's original 250kg bomb onto. The 2 lower exhausts were then glued to the lower wing, and then I glued the cannons to the wheel well and the base of the outer cannon to the wings after the barrel had been removed. I installed the seat, joystick and rudder pedals, which I had to cut out and clean up, along with the main instrument panel to the cockpit tub. After I glued the main exhaust to one of the fuselage halves, I then prepared the interior parts for painting by using some Vallejo gloss black primer thinned with 1 part thinner to 3 parts primer. I sprayed several light passes over the side walls, the wheel wells, the cockpit tub, the engine and the pilot, who I mounted on a cocktail stick. I let the primer cure overnight, and the next day I painted highlights onto the various raised surfaces of these parts using some Vallejo Model Air Insignia White. I got a lot of spider webbing, which means that the paint must have been a little bit too thin, and I also found I seemed to have a lot of dry pigments build up, which would then cause blockages. I found that using Model Colour Flat White is a bit better than the Model Air Insignia White. Once dried, which being acrylics didn't take too long, I then sprayed all of the cockpit area parts with Vallejo Model Air RLM 66, and for the cockpit mixed a ratio of 1 part paint to 1 part thinners. I then painted the interior of the wheel wells with some Vallejo Model Air RLM 02, which was applied using the same ratio. The engine was painted in Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, which used the same ratio as well. With the base colours down, I then used a very fine SMS paintbrush to paint the raised sidewall details using Vallejo Model Colour Flat Yellow, Vallejo Model Colour Vermilion Red, and Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black. The flat black was also used to paint the joystick, main instrument panel, cannon assembly and the engine gearbox. A tiny dab of Model Air Aluminium was applied onto the rudder pedals and the joystick buttons, while some Vallejo Model Air gunmetal was used to paint the inside of the cannon barrels. To add some interior metal chipping, I apply some Tamiya XF16 onto a brush, and after removing the excess, I dab it onto the seat and along some of the raised areas in the cockpit and landing gear bay. Annoyingly, I forgot to airbrush some of the wheel well details that are moulded to the upper wings, so I decided to brush paint them instead with the Model Air RLM02, though being designed for airbrushing, this rather thin paint took quite a few coats until it was nice and solid. RLM02 was also applied to the inside walls of the engine. Once the upper wing details had had a few coats, I glued the 2 wing halves and clamped them together using some bulldog clips. Unfortunately, there was a bit of a gap between the 2 wing halves, which I believe might be because of the cannon barrels. The cockpit tub was then glued to the left fuselage side, and before adding the right side, I applied some Tamiya black panel accent over the entirety of the interior, along with the engine and wheel wells to help highlight their recessed details and give them a bit of a grimy appearance. The excess wash was then removed using a cotton bud and some enamel thinners, which also helped it flow more into just the recesses. There are no moulded details on the instrument panel, but decals are included, which I stuck in some warm water and then slid onto the instrument panel part and applied some Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them to help them stick. And with the cockpit done, I glued the fuselage halves together and clamped them as well before adding the engine, which didn't really fit very well. The lower wing had a lot of flash and excess plastic where it met the rear fuselage, which I then had to sand before gluing it to the underside of the fuselage. While the wings and fuselage bonded, I cut out the two parts for the upper cowling, the horizontal stabilizers, the step ladder, which I would not attach until later on, and the rudder. Unfortunately, while handling the model, I damaged one of the cannon barrels and the pitot tube that's molded to one of the wings. I managed to locate and reattach the cannon barrel, but unfortunately I lost the pitot tube and would have to find a replacement later on. The rudder was then glued into place, followed by the two horizontal stabilizers and the engine cowling. The rudder and stabilizers fitted perfectly into place, but unfortunately the cowlings would require a fair bit of sanding and fiddling to manage a good fit. I had to remove the engine piece from the fuselage though, as I forgot to add the cowling fan and washer before gluing the engine in place so that the prop would spin. Once locked into the engine by the washer, I then glued the engine back to the fuselage and attached the cowlings. With most of the assembly completed for the aircraft, I decided to begin masking off the wheel wells using some blue tack to fit the retracted gear parts into place. To prepare the rest of the model for priming, I filled in any gaps with Vallejo water-based putty using a cocktail stick, and once the putty was applied, I removed the excess using a damp finger. There were quite a few bad gaps, especially around the cowling and along the wing seams, and where the lower wing meets the fuselage. I then let the putty dry overnight, and the next day sanded away the excess using a nail file and some very fine sandpaper. I also sanded down the seam line between the fuselage halves. Any panel lines that were lost were carefully rescored using a knife, and with that done, I masked the engine and cockpit using some white tack, and for the rear fuselage area I used some Tamiya masking tape, and with that, the model was ready for priming. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the build on this one. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and feel free to share any questions or advice in the comment section below. If you want to support my channel further and get perks such as early ad-free viewing of my videos, cults, discounts, and the occasional exclusive bit of content, then please check out my Patreon page, which I'll leave a link to in the description. In part 2, I'll be covering painting the aircraft, which will be the first time I've ever done a German scheme using an airbrush. And the following week I'll be finishing up with part 3 covering the weathering, and I'll be releasing a full version of this build with all 3 parts combined. That's it for this video, but as always, until the next one, take care and model on.